Hi, I'm Ken Park from BFX Furniture and welcome to our first webinar, Future Focused Learning Designed for the Long Haul with Anne Nock. Several months ago, Anne came into our Maroochydore showroom and we hosted 50 principals, educators and teachers. We had such positive feedback, we asked Anne to come back to record it so we could share it with all of you. To tell you a bit about Anne, she's been working with schools for 15 years, helping to facilitate innovation and change in learning environments. To tell you a little bit about the webinar, you'll see to the top right hand side of the screen there'll be polls that pop up. There's a chat there that'll allow you to communicate with the other viewers. There's a questions tab up there also, and we'll have staff from BFX on hand to help you out wherever you need. Now, it's been our pleasure to host this webinar. Please enjoy.
This whole idea of design for the long haul is about how do we create learning environments that are sustainable rather than filling it with furniture looking nice in a photograph, but then it's just not going to work for the people who are there. And I've chosen that opening slide, the photograph on that opening slide with the how for a reason. Because so often it's the how we do this that seems to get lost, I think, gets lost in the process. So before we even get to that how, we also get to the why we do this thing. And we do this because of Sophie. Sophie's in grade 3 and in a few short years she's going to be in high school. And at the end of the 2020s she'll be finishing school, and sometime in the 2030s she's going to be in the workforce. What's the workforce for Sophie going to be like? Is it going to be like it is today? Definitely not like it was yesterday. But we're coming into an environment where it's going to be very, very different for Sophie. And she's going to need a new set of skills that will navigate her life. Not a defined set of skills, but often those things we call soft skills that will help her to navigate working with people, having communication, collaboration skills, those kinds of things. But we need to start the things that Sophie needs today in her education. Not think, oh, in the future, she'll learn that on the job. She's not going to learn it on the job. We have to start today. So the way we organise our learning environment is really important to that, because there's an environment that is just tables and desks facing the front with no room to move. It's great for didactic instruction, explicit teaching, still a really important part of it, but it doesn't allow for the other skills of communication, collaboration, those kinds of things to take root. So thinking about the environment today enables Sophie to learn the skills she's going to need for the future. I love to think in metaphors, and I often use the idea of this metaphor of the bowling alley. It's a bit of a negative metaphor in that it's not the way we want school to be, but it's a way we can think about it. If you've ever walked into a bowling alley and you walk in and there's lane upon lane upon lane, and standing to attention at the end of every lane are those pins. And the pins are like the students. They're standing up straight and they're waiting for the ball to be hurtled down the lane. Now, if we think about that, the teacher is the bowler, bowling the ball down the lane, heading toward the pins. She's anything like me. She might hit none. She occasionally might connect with all, but generally some of those pins will still stay standing. And education today, what we're looking for is how do we create an educational environment where actually if the pins were the children, they would all connect with the learning. And in this metaphor, you've got English teachers bowling balls down the lane after lane, and behind them, there's the maths one ready to come down. And it's like this idea of if we bowl a ball down, then we've done our job as a teacher. And it's so much more than that. It's so much more than I've delivered the content, job done. We have to actually think about transforming our practice with Sophie in mind. And all those pins being those kids, how do we make sure the learning connects with every single one of those? So I love the idea of transformation. How do we transform things? How do we transform our culture so that our culture is in line with our desires for education? But then the other part of it is the ecosystem. How do we transform the ecosystem? And I'll talk about that a little later. So this is where we get back to the how. People think about how do we transform our learning culture? Now, I like a metaphor, just like the bowling ball's a metaphor. I love thinking in metaphors, and so much of our language is around metaphors. And so I'm using this as the idea of the house. If we're building a new school, a new learning environment, How can we use the process of building to guide our practice of transforming the culture of our school? Just like we lay our foundations first, how do we lay that foundation of strategic intent? What's our why? Then following that, we put the walls up. And so how do we build those structures for building blocks for growth either side of the walls? And when we're putting the roof on, we're creating our overarching pedagogy. And once we get the key and we can go inside, then we look at the internal fit out. What's the internal work we need to do for each of our children, our teachers? Because today, when I'm talking about transforming learning culture, I'm actually talking about the teaching force and how do we help teachers to transform their thinking and practice so that the Sophies of this world can have an education that they need for their future. The next thing I like to think about is transforming the learning ecosystem, and that really is addressing that how. I've identified 4 elements in the learning ecosystem: the teaching team, the learning space and its affordances, creating a climate for inclusivity and diversity, and then systems thinking. How do we just make it work? Often if people have heard me speak, they've heard me talk about the school in Sweden that I visited a number of years ago. How it was brand new, no kids in the school yet, no teachers even, I think. And we were shown around this school that had everything we look for in the new modern classrooms and school design. Open spaces, small nooks. I particularly love this little cafe nook where the little tables with the light hanging down and the kids could work across each other. It had those gathering stairs. It had a whole lot of the elements that we look for in schools today. And I went back to this school a year and a half later, once it was in practice, once the kids were there and the teachers were there. And I saw a very different side. I saw where there was once openness, the spaces had been closed off with cupboards and bookshelves, and they just looked ugly. I went to look for this particular spot, and I found this. I found that nobody thought about how could we utilise this space more effectively? How could we take use of those little nooks, the cafe area? And this image has actually been the one that's driven me to think we need to do a lot of work with our people. We need to get our people thinking, how are we going to create that environment where teachers are able to modify their thinking and their practice to take advantage of the opportunities that things like that learning environment might bring. I often tell this story when I'm talking to other people around, and I remember talking about this to a school business manager recently, and he was telling me that when they were building their new building, they kept it closed and they didn't talk to the teachers about it because they love the idea of we're going to get a big surprise. We're going to go, ta-da, the building's opened. Isn't this awesome? But what he realised when he said to me, I shouldn't have done the ta-da. Actually, I should have done a lot of that foundational work along the way that would help people to adapt their practice. And like that diagram with the house, get the thinking, get the building working well. We all have a to-do list, those things we need to get done today, this week, this year. But do we have a to-don't list? That conscious idea of, this is something I'm not going to do. And I think in the terms of a to-don't list is, don't do the ta-da. Bring people along the journey rather than surprise it, because it's actually going to affect their practice. And perhaps they're stressing out knowing that this is going to change. The second thing on the to-don't list is the process of change. We tend to think about, well, we've got this new learning space, we've got this new school, and we're just going to, it's going to be perfect once it's done. But you know what? We never actually get to the point where we've tied a bow and it's done. There's always change happening. There's always things we need to do. One principal in Sydney I know, he talks about it being, he is constantly challenged and supported to collaboratively work with his leaders. That sense of being constant, it's never an ending process. And the next thing he says is that he's working with his leaders, his teachers and students to co-design and establish what he calls the new normal. Co-design, it's something you're doing together. So second on our to-don't list is this idea of it's never ever finished. So when we talk about design and the whole idea of designing for the long haul, we often think about this in terms of our students. Who are the students we're designing for, and what are the future that they need? As I mentioned earlier, Sophie is always my benchmark. I go back to her as my what would Sophie do moment, and how do we provide a best education for her? And one of the things we need to think about is the education of today or the past the best one for Sophie in the future? I've taken to visualising lately, and I'm developing my skill in visualising, and I love the idea of drawing. In my workshops, I will often have opportunities for drawing, and I know people always say, but I can't draw. And I think, well, if we're exhibiting in an art gallery, well, we probably do need to draw. But if we're getting our ideas out, it's more about getting the ideas than actually the value of the drawing. So I often get people to draw a metaphor for learning. I get them to think about what is the best metaphor for them as they think about how they see learning. Often people talk about a garden or a journey or a metamorphosis. And when they draw these ideas, they are thinking about, well, who would the student be in this drawing? What does the student, if the student's the plant, what does that look like for success for that student? Who are the teachers? Who are the parents? And just getting their ideas out in a drawn form. I came across this piece of research recently called The Surprisingly Powerful Influence of Drawing on Memory. And I found it quite fascinating to think how drawing is actually a valid way of students learning and increasing learning. And I always think, because I do a lot of my work with teachers and educators, and I always translate professional learning and student learning and think, well, we're all people, so how do we all learn? And I think this is a really interesting piece of research on drawing and how we need to keep drawing. So it talks about what are the strategies students normally use to learn and remember. And if we all think about it, many of us in any seminar that we're doing, we're taking notes. We're often getting our kids to rote learn. I don't know about you, but I do read aloud when I'm trying to learn something to try and get this in my brain. Or enactment. How do we get kids to enact? And this article identified these 4 as the kind of the core ways that the strategies that we use to help students learn and remember. But then it says, did you know that pictures are better remembered than words? Because pictures can represent visual features and verbal labels. And it's this thing called the picture superiority effect. So I use this often in workshops to get people to actually get their ideas out in drawing. Now, this whole idea of can't draw, if you look really carefully at that, look at my drawing of a person. It's not anything fancy. It's a guy. He's got a body of a rectangle and a circle for a head and a few lines. It doesn't have to be an artistic representation. It just has to be something that you recognise as a person. So what I'd love people to think about is, if you're having a story of transformation, what's your story? What story is it that you can draw? So I don't know if you realise this, but they say that there are only 7 stories in the whole world. Every story that we might see falls into one of these 7 categories. We're actually going to look at 5 categories today. The other 2 are comedy and tragedy, and they're just too close to home for us to know that we live often in comedy and tragedy. I want you to think about these ones. These 5 story types. The first one is overcoming the monster. The second is the quest. Third, rebirth. Fourth, rags to riches. And 5th, voyage and return. If you're looking at transforming your school and your environment, I wonder which of these stories might be able to be a way that you can draw and represent your ideas. So in your story, as you do this, I wonder if you can describe and draw the context and the conditions. How might teacher transformation or staff transformation or cultural transformation be represented in this story? What are the other influences? What are the prevailing conditions? And finally, spoiler alert, what happens at the end of your story? I often use this as a collaborative technique to get people together around a piece of paper, a whiteboard, and to unpack their story. So if we go back, to unpack their story. So they're using both the visual features and the verbal labels. How powerful is that as we unpack our cultural transformation to see what's my story, and rather than assume we know the elements, actually carefully address it in this way. So that's one of the techniques that I use in transforming people, is to actually get on the same page and tell a story together. The other way I'm working with schools is thinking about this whole idea of transformation in terms of this model. It's called the ADKAR model. It's used in business. Each of us, when we're facing change, we have particular drivers. Often when people are facing change, there's fear attached to it. There's a sense of, I don't know if I can do this. But rather than address the fear, let's have a look at what the people's needs are. So this ADKAR model is an acronym for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. Each of your people, as you're transitioning to, say, new learning environments, will have a strength in some areas and need extra help in others. For example, if you've done a lot of that foundational work, they probably have a good awareness of the idea of change. How do we change? We're in an environment where Sophie, as an example, or students at the school need to have a different education. They need to be an environment where collaboration, critical thinking, communication is valued. So their awareness might be strong, but their desire might be quite small. So how do we help them to address that desire for change? They may have knowledge. You may have had lots of information sessions about it, but what's their ability to change? And what elements of their ability, their capacity to change, need to be have further development of new skills and behaviours that's going to help them to address that change? So the ADKAR model itself is a really nice one. Awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and then how we're going to reinforce that change to keep it going for the long haul, which is what I'm all about. So I wonder if you can think of an initiative that you're wanting to grow at your school. It might be you want to create multiple shared learning zones. You might want to develop a co-teaching culture. For so long, teaching has been a solo profession. Teachers have been on their own. They haven't been able to work. They haven't had the necessity to work alongside another teacher. We can't just put people in a space and go, off you go. We actually need to go back and think, well, if we're going to get teachers to work in a co-teaching culture, what are the elements of the ADKAR model do they need to help them to embrace this new way of working? Have you raised the awareness of why teachers working in teams matters? So another initiative you might be wanting to implement is how classes might be co-located in a shared space. There's so much that needs to happen with that co-location. And that shift from teacher-focused education to learning-centred, if we think about that photo right at the start, where all those desks were facing the front, that's the teacher controlling the action. What needs to happen if we're going to make it a learner-centred environment? Or collaborative planning. If we think about the bowling alley the ball's going down, those English teachers might be just repeating the same class after class. What if they brought their ideas together? What if they collaboratively planned? What if they saved a whole lot of time and energy by being collaborative? Or maybe there's something else you're keen to grow. But these are often the initiatives that I find that people are working with their schools and how they're going to get their teachers and their schools to change the culture. I wonder if there's an initiative that you're keen to implement or grow in your school. Maybe in your new building projects, classes are co-located in the same space. There's many things that can happen, and this process, this activity, can be applied to a whole lot of change elements in your school, things you want to start afresh. I call it a spanner in the works. Now, this isn't your normal activity. It's also my other title I give it is The Glass Half Empty. It's a bit of fun, and let's take it from a fun perspective. So first of all, the first thing you need to do is think about what's our biggest cultural change initiative that's coming up that we want to shift people's thinking and practice. The next thing I want you to do, and I hope this is the fun part, list everything you can think of that will sabotage this transformation and create the worst possible outcomes. Don't just start with one or two, just go crazy and think of from the worst possible point of view. What would be the total spanner in the works for this project if it would all go wrong? But now, let's come back to reality. You've got a list of these things on the page. For each of those items on that page, ask yourself, is there anything that we are currently doing that resembles this in any possible way? It's like a dagger in the heart, isn't it? It's anything on that list that resembles the things that you don't want to do, they're the things that you need to actually work on as well. I wonder if you can actually circle those things on the list and together work out, well, what are the top 3 things we need to address? And from those 3 things, what's our next step for each one that's going to create that change? So once you've done that, you've actually started a new to-do list. Even though the activity started from the negative, we've turned this around to create, okay, these are the things we need to do, because as we have this cultural transformation, we don't want to bring old practices into the new space. So let's just go back to where we started. We started with Sophie and her future. It's why we exist. We want the best possible future for Sophie. We talked about transforming your learning culture. And that is about how do we help our teachers in particular, but also our whole school culture to be able to transform so that we're providing an education for Sophie that is future focused and not one that relates to her past. Remember, we talked about how do we lay our foundations? What are our strategic intent? How do we make sure that everyone's on the same page? How do we grow our support walls? What needs to happen to make sure people are supported in transformation? How do we shape our overarching pedagogy? And finally, how do we deal with the internals of people? Many people fear change. And I think the ADKAR model that I spoke about earlier is one way that you can say, well, what do our people actually need to support them through the process of change? So I hope this was helpful as we transform the learning culture, and we can move on to now to think about how do we transform our learning ecosystem.
Hi everyone, thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed our webinar. I'd like to take a moment to thank Anne Nock for allowing us to record her presentation. If you'd like to learn more about Anne Nock, please visit www.annenock.com.au. We'll post a link in the chat. We're also going to email you out a replay link so that you could watch again. Please feel free to share that link with your friends and colleagues. The chat feature will stay open, so if you have any further questions or comments about the webinar or any of the furniture, please feel free to ask there. At BFX Furniture, we're doing our part to help move education forward into the 21st century. BFX Furniture is an Australian company that specialises in education furniture and spaces. We have 40 specialist consultants across the country, so it's safe to say that service is the BFX difference. Our huge range of furniture will be able to help you with all your furniture needs. If you would like more information, please see www.bfx.com.au or call 1300 866 522. Thanks for your time.